What is up, YouTube? Before I get into this video, let me remind you, if you like my content, hit the like and subscribe button, and also if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on my Patreon at patreon.com/uncommonramen. That is with a capital U and a capital R. I do all this in my free time, so any amount of support can help me bring more of this content to you more often. Alright, today I wanted to do another deck tech, and I decided to show off another Selesnya deck. I was in the process of trying to make a Selesnya deck that didn't use +1/+1 counters and tokens, because that's pretty much what all Selesnya decks do. And in lieu of the fact that I had my Torsten deck, which was a blink deck, but really it was just a +1/+1 counter and tokens deck, I thought, okay, I will make this nice, cool little Satsuki deck that uses sagas. I have all these sagas laying around. It'd be really cool to use them, only to find out that it just basically is a +1/+1 counter and token deck. So you've been warned. All right. So Satsuki, the Living Lore, is a green-white for 1/3. You can tap her to put a lore counter on each saga you control, and you can only activate that as a sorcery. When Satsuki the Living Lore dies, you get to choose one. Either return a saga or enchantment creature card you control to your hand, or return target saga from your graveyard to your hand. So she can recur the sagas. She isn't necessarily something that you need out on the field constantly, and she actually benefits you more often than not when she dies. So she actually plays as a very flexible commander for this deck. So we're going to take a look at the creatures that I put in here. As you can imagine, most of the creatures in here are for enchantment payoffs. It is an Enchantress deck, so we're going to see quite a few of those as well. Let me just get those. Is that the last one? Yep, okay. Starting with the Ajani's Chosen, 2/2 white for a 3/3. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you get to put 2/2 white cat creature token onto the battlefield. If the enchantment is an aura, you may attach it to the token. We're not going to see, I don't think, any auras in this deck, because really, honestly, with the number of sagas that were available, there was just no room for them, to be honest. Next up, we have Archon of Sun's Grace for 2/2 white. This is a 3/4 with flying with lifelink. Pegasus creatures you control have lifelink, and it has Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you get to create a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token with flying. So we get to create an army of 2/2s with flying and lifelink, and this has been a huge thorn in my opponent's sides many times. Next up, we have the Auramancer for 2 white. It's a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. Sagas don't last long. They have 3 chapters, so most of them have 3 chapters, so once those chapters are done, they end up in your graveyard, so Auramancer will help you bring at least one of those back. We got Destiny Spinner for 2 and a green, a 2/3. Creature and enchantment spells you control can't be countered. For 3 and a green, target land you control becomes an XX elemental creature token with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is the number of enchantments you control. It's still land. So despite the fact that the sagas are going to be dying relatively regularly, the sagas aren't the only things in here that are enchantments. There's still several enchantments that aren't sagas, as well as creatures that are also enchantments. So this will still see value. More importantly, a lot of the sagas in here are very cheap, and so it's not unusual to have multiple sagas in play starting at chapter 1. So this still sees value from that as well. This deck is crazy when it comes to board presence. Next up, we have Eidolon of Blossoms, 2/2 green for a 2/2. It has Constellation. Whenever Eidolon of Blossoms or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you get to draw cards. It's just an Enchantress effect. We've got Femerith Enchantress, green-white For a 1/2, whenever an enchantment is put into a graveyard from play, you get to draw a card. I like this because it's kind of the opposite of what a normal enchantress does, where we see enchantments coming into play. This one sees them leaving play, and since sagas are regularly leaving play, you're going to see value off of that quite often. I also like it because it doesn't just see your enchantments leaving the battlefield, it actually sees all enchantments. So if your opponent's stuff gets killed, you get to benefit from that as well. Next up, we have Generous Visitor for 1 green. Whenever you for 1 green, it's a 1/1. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So this is playing into the whole +1/+1 counters and tokens thing. We're gonna have a lot of effects that put +1/+1 counters. Next up, we have Herald of the Pantheon, 1 and a green for a 2/2. Enchantment spells cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain a life. Couple of my friends that I played this deck against have deemed this deck the anti-aristocrats deck because you gain life just about as quickly as you lose life against an aristocrats deck. I've played it a couple times and I've seen that being roughly the case. If your opponents don't deal with certain creatures in your deck, it's really hard for an aristocrats deck to get any kind of value off of you specifically. Next up, we have Jukai Naturalist. This is a green-white for a 2/2 with lifelink. Enchantment spells cost 1 less to cast, and you'll see that these both have that cost reducer. It's just to reduce the cost of these enchantments that we're playing to be as low as possible so we can play as many as possible on any given turn. Next up, we have Kami of Transience. This is a 1 and a green for a 2/2 with trample. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Kami of Transience. At the beginning of each end step, if an enchantment was put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, you may return Kami of Transience from your graveyard to your hand. Kami of Transience is kind of a pretty big beater in this deck. It's going to get big pretty quickly, and if it dies, you can reoccur it, especially in a deck like this where the sagas are going to the graveyard quite often. You're going to see this get reoccurred pretty regularly as well. And that's extremely helpful in a deck like this to get a beater that can close out the game. Next up, we have Mesa Enchantress. This is 1 and 2 white for a 0/2. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you may draw a card. This is just the color-shifted version of Verdurn Enchantress. We've got Moon Blessed Cleric for 2 and a white. It's a 3/2. It has Divine Intervention. When Moon Blessed Cleric enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, and then shuffle and put that card on top. So it's a tutor for enchantments. You'll notice we don't actually, when we get later into the video, you'll notice that we don't actually have Enlightened Tutor in here. And you'll see why when we get in there. This one is very cool because, again, it sees enchantments, which means it also sees the enchantment creatures, and it has some versatility to it. Next up, we have Sanctum Weaver, 1 and a green for a 0/2. You can tap to add X mana of any one color to your mana pool, where X is the number of enchantments you control. Again, it's pretty solid in here, even with all the enchantments leaving play. We got Satyr Enchanter for 1, a green and a white, is a 2/2. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, draw a card. We're going to take advantage of quite a few different Enchantress effects in here, so this one's not surprising. We got Setessan Champion for 2 and a green. It's a 1/3 with Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Setessan Champion and draw a card. So she has an Enchantress ability and she gets +1/+1 counters, which makes her quite formidable. The one downside being that she isn't an enchantment herself, but that can also be considered a good thing because it means that you have to target her with creature-specific removal as opposed to, well, I guess permanent-specific could hit too, but enchantment-specific removal will not hit her. Next up, we have Starfield Mystic. Like the Femerif, it sees cards leaving, or sees enchantments leaving. It's 1 and white for a 2/2. Enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Starfield Mystic. Again, very cool with this deck. Sagas regularly leave, and it gives you an opportunity to take advantage of that. Next up, we have Sun Titan, 4 and 2 white for a 6/6 with Vigilance. When Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return a permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. The benefit of this one is actually pretty high in this deck because a lot of the sagas are CMC 3 or less. So we can just continuously reoccur the sagas, not to mention anything else that costs 3 or less that gets removed, like any of your enchantresses for that matter. Next up, we have Sithis, Harvest's Hand, a green and a white for a 1/2. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain a life and draw a card. This one is up there with the Herald of Pantheon in the sense that it really breaks aristocrat decks. The amount of life you can gain during your turn varies, but with these two cards in play, gets pretty out of hand. Next up, we have Teshar, Ancestor's Apostle. This is 3 and a white for a 2/2 with flying. Whenever you cast a historic spell, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. It is very good in here. Historic spells are legendaries as well as sagas and artifacts. This card will see all of those cards in here because we'll have all of those cards. And that means that you can continuously reoccur some of the bigger linchpin pieces that might have died, such as the Sanctum Weaver or it says 3 or less, right? Yeah, so any of your enchantresses, stuff like that. You won't, I don't think you see I think actually you do see the Setessan Champion. You just don't see the Starfield Mystic. Oh, you do see Starfield. Okay, there's a handful of cards in here you won't see, but usually those cards are not that impactful by comparison. Next up, almost last, we have Verdurn Enchantress, 1 and 2 green for a 0/2. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you may draw a card. Again, just Enchantress effects. We have Weaver of Harmony, 1 and a green for a 2/2. Other enchantment creatures you control get +1/+1. And for a green, you can tap this to copy target activated or triggered ability you control from an enchantment source. You may choose new targets for the copy. This has a lot of utility in the deck. The Anthem is kind of negligible, but the copy ability is really cool for any of your enchantresses that are also enchantments, but also copying the triggered abilities of any enchantments you have as well. I don't think it sees sagas when they tick down. I might be wrong about that. You can check that for yourself, but it does see some of the triggers from other enchantments that we have. Next up, we're going to take a look at instants. As you can imagine, because this is an enchantment deck, there aren't a lot of instants or sorceries. We start with a Beast Within, 2 and a green to destroy a permanent and give them a 3/3 beast in replacement. For 3 and a white, we have Cosmic Intervention. This can be foretold for 1 and a white. If a permanent you control would be put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, exile it instead, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. This is a cool way to reoccur a saga if it's really impactful, but also to reoccur an incidental death on your side. Next up, we have Path to Exile. For 1 white, exile a creature. Its controller may search their library for a basic land, shuffle, and put that land into play tapped. Next up, we have Story Weave for 2 and a green. You get to choose one to either put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, or to put 2 lore counters on a saga you control, and the next time one or more enchantment creatures enter the battlefield under your control, this turn each enters with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it. Either of these modes really work, but if you have a token generating saga, the second mode is really good for getting the tokens out and giving them extra +1/+1 counters. So obviously we have it in here for that second mode as the most impactful part, but you could use either. And then finally we have Swords to Plowshares. For 1 white, you exile target creature and its controller gains life equal to its power. Next we look at sorceries. It's a few more sorceries because there's some pretty impactful sorceries, starting with Brilliant Restoration. This costs 3 and 4 white, but you return all artifact and enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. This can be devastating, depending on how late in the game this is. And we see artifacts with this too, so if you, for whatever reason, lost your rocks, which there aren't very many artifacts in here, then you have a chance to bring them back. But enchantments also encompasses enchantment creatures, so we get back some of those impactful enchantment creatures as well as the sagas and whatnot. This is a very good card in this deck. Next up, we have Cultivate. It's pretty simple. 2 and a green, search your library for 2 basic lands, put 1 into your hand, put 1 onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. We got Idyllic Tutor for 2 and a white. You get to search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, and put it in your hand, then shuffle. So we use Idyllic Tutor instead of Enlightened Tutor, partially because Enlightened Tutor is kind of expensive. The Idyllic Tutor takes a little bit longer to get out there, but there are better 1-drops that you could play. I personally believe that. There's a lot of sagas that you could just play on turn 1 that you may want to run out before doing something like a tutor. Not to mention, the tutor really should be for something impactful, and I mean, as we go through, you can kind of decide for yourself. Next up, we have Rampant Growth. 1 and a green, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Next, we have Resurgent Belief. This is a suspend spell. You can suspend it for 2 counters if you pay 1 and a white. When it casts from suspend, return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Very similar to the Brilliant Restoration, but only sees enchantments, which is all we need in here. It's very impactful in this deck. The one downside being that it is broadcast, so if your opponents can find a way to get rid of your graveyard, then you kind of get screwed on that one. Next up, we have Search for Glory. This is 2 and a white to search your library for a snow permanent card or legendary card or saga card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. You gain life for each snow spent to cast the spell. There are no snow lands in here. This is just going to be for the tutor ability. I could arbitrarily run snow lands, but I don't particularly see any reason, just for 1 card, so no snow lands in here. But it's another tutor. It sees sagas or legendaries. So you could use it for either of those. Very cool. It does see snow permanents too, but this is actually, I think, the only snow card in the deck. But if you did put snow lands in here, you could use it to fetch a land if you needed to. Lastly, we have Unnatural Restoration. For 1 and a green, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand and then proliferate. Whether you know it or not, sagas do actually have counters on them. They're called lore counters, so proliferating that would actually add another lore counter to each of your sagas if you so choose to, as well as any +1/+1 counters, so on and so forth. So proliferate in this deck is highly useful, even though we don't use it a lot. Next up is going to be artifacts. This is just mana rocks, and there aren't that many. We start with Arcane Signet. It costs 2. You can tap it to add 1 of your color identity. Then we have Power Conduit. This costs 2, but you can tap it to remove a counter from a permanent you control, and then choose to either put a charge counter on target artifact or put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. You can use this to remove lore counters from sagas and continuously repeat the abilities of certain sagas, and at the same time get +1/+1 counters on your creatures. So this actually has a huge amount of impact in this game, or in this deck, specifically if there is a saga that has an ability that is really, really good. You can continuously repeat that ability just because you want to repeat that ability, and in the process you get a bunch of +1/+1 counters. It's just a really good card in here. Next up, we have Selesnya Signet. It costs 2. You can pay 1 and tap it to add a green and a white. We got Soul Ring, costs 1, and you can tap it to add 2 colorless. All right, next up is enchantments. Most of these are sagas, and there's a very large amount of enchantments. Okay, so we start with Azusa's Many Journeys. This is 1 and a green. Some of these sagas are normal sagas. Some of them are read-ahead sagas. I'm not going to point that out. You guys know which ones are which. Azusa's Many Journeys. Chapter 1, you may play an additional land this turn. Chapter 2, you gain 3 life. And Chapter 3, exile the saga and return to the battlefield transformed under your control. So I will show the sides of these that transform. So we got Likeness of the Seeker. Whenever Likeness of the Seeker becomes blocked, untap up to 3 lands you control. This is actually really good, especially if you have second main phase plays, like playing more sagas or whatnot. It's actually pretty good. Right, next up, we are going to have Battle for Bredegard. This is 1, a green and a white. Chapter 1 says, create a 1/1 white human warrior creature token. Chapter 2 says create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. And Chapter 3 says choose any number of artifacts, tokens, or creature tokens. Sorry. Any number of artifact tokens and or creature tokens you control with different names. For each of them, create a token that's a copy of it. This is actually disgustingly good in this deck because you're going to create a lot of tokens. If you happen to have a lot of Pegasus tokens and an Archon in play, it doubles the amount of those Pegasus tokens you have, which can be really devastating for your opponents. Even if they manage to remove the Archon, those things are still 2/2 flyers and actually possibly bigger, depending on how many +1/+1 counters have been flying around. This is another one of those that if you removed a counter from it, it would just continuously repeat Chapter 3, and that could be insanely impactful for the game. Befriending the Moths is 3 and a white. Chapter 1 and 2 are target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains flying until end of turn, so we get a little bit of an evasion there. And then Chapter 3 is to exile it and return it to the battlefield transformed as a Imperial Moth, which is just a 2/4 with flying. It is also an enchantment creature, so that's just important to note when it comes to ETB effects. Next up, we have Boseiju Reaches Skyward. Chapter 1 has you search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle. Chapter 2 says put up to 1 target land card from your graveyard on top of your library, and then... yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I guess. And then Chapter 3 has you exile this and return it transformed. So we're just going to go ahead and... if I can get it out of the sleeve. So it returns as Branch of Boseiju. This is a 0/0 reach. Branch of Boseiju gets +1/+1 for each land you control. So it just gets bigger and it has reach, which can be a big deal in here. There's not a lot. Well, I guess there is a lot of flyers in here, so... but a big reach guy. You can't argue with that. Next up, we have Elspeth Conquers Death. 3 and 2 white. Exile target permanent an opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or greater. Chapter 2 is non-creature spells your opponents cast cost 2 more to cast until your next turn. And then Chapter 3 says return target creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a +1/+1 counter or a loyalty counter on it. There's only one planeswalker in here. It's pretty obvious which one it is. There are tons of creatures that this could target. So this is actually just really good no matter what. And again, this last ability is really good for abuse with the power conduit. Not to mention this part right here, non-creature spells your opponent's cast cost 2 more to cast until end of your next turn. Repeatedly abusing that to create a stacks piece is actually not a terrible idea. Next up, we have Enchantress Suppressants. This is 2 and a green. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you draw a card. Yeah, self-explanatory. Love that it's an enchantment, so other enchantresses see it. Next, we have Era of Enlightenment for 1 and a white. Chapter 1 says scry 2. Chapter 2 says gain 2 life. And Chapter 3 says exile the Saga and return it to the battlefield transformed. It returns as Hand of Enlightenment, which is a 2/2 monk with first strike. Again, some of this is negligible. These creatures have pretty low power, but there's going to be, like I said, a lot of +1/+1 counters floating around, so eventually these become pretty impactful. All right, next up we have Fall of the Imposter for 1, a green and a white. Chapters 1 and 2 say put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. Chapter 3 says exile a creature with the greatest power among creatures target opponent controls. Just a nice removal piece. And again, if you find a way to to remove counters from this before it gets sacrificed, you can abuse that ability multiple times. I don't know if you can respond to that. You can at least abuse the second one. I don't know if you can, in response to the sacrifice trigger, use the power conduit. Somebody can correct me in the comments on that one. I'm not sure. Because I think I've said that twice on a Chapter 3, or 3 times maybe, or 4 times now. Well, either way, let me know in the comments below if you can abuse the power conduit on that one. Otherwise, you can actually just abuse Chapter 2 lots, which is still not a bad effect. All right, next up we have Historian's Boon for 3 and a white. Whenever Historian's Boon or another non-token enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you get to create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. And whenever the final chapter ability of a saga you control triggers, you get to create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. This is, if you're running a saga deck, you have to run this because the 4/4 flyers with vigilance are arguably very difficult for your opponents to deal with. Very good cards, or very, very good tokens. Next up, we have History of Benalia. For 1 and 2 white, chapters 1 and 2 create a 2/2 white creature token with white knight creature token with vigilance. And chapter 3 says knights you control get +2/+1 until end of turn, which is really good. I mean, that can be a very swingy turn. Next up, we have Jugan Defends the Temple for 2 and a green. Chapter 1 says create a 1/1 green monk creature token with tap to add green mana. Chapter 2 says put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to two target creatures. And then Chapter 3 says exile the saga and return it. And we get Remnant of the Rising Star. It's a 2/2 with flying. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay X. When you do, put X +1/+1 counters on that creature. As long as you control 5 or more modified creatures, Remnant of the Rising Star gets +5/+5 and trample. So it turns into a 7/7 with trample as long as you have modified creatures. And this deck is throwing +1/+1 counters around already. So this ability doesn't technically even have to happen for it to become the 7/7 pretty quickly, if not on transformation. But having this ability, the ability to just throw around even more +1/+1 counters, especially at X cost, is really incredible. All right, next up we have Love Song of Night and Day. This is 2 and a white. Chapter 1 says you and target opponent each draw 2 cards. Chapter 2 says create a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying. And Chapter 3 says put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Just really cool. Next up we have Michiko's Reign of Truth, 1 and a white. Chapters 1 and 2 say target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and each artifact and or enchantment. For each artifact and or enchantment you control. That can be really big. With flyers and cards with trample, that can be very, very powerful. Chapter 3 says exile the saga and return it. So we're going to return it as Portrait of Michiko. Portrait of Michiko gets +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment you control. She's a 0/0. So that is actually a really powerful one. This is one of my favorite sagas in here. Okay, next up we're going to look at Sigil of the Empty Throne. For 3 and 2 white, whenever you play an enchantment spell, put a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying into play. This is a little bit better than the Historian's Boon, where the Historian's Boon is going to give us tokens with vigilance and flying. This one sees every enchantment that enters the battlefield, so this can be pretty impactful in a game, and it shouldn't be allowed to live. Your opponents will have trouble with the amount of angels you'll be creating. Next up, we have Song of Freyalise. For 1 and a green, chapters 1 and 2 say until your next turn, creatures you control gain add 1 mana of any one color if you tap it. For chapter 3, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance, trample, and indestructible until end of turn. Depending on how late game this final effect happens, that can actually be the end of a game. Even though it's only 1 +1/+1 counter, a lot of your creatures are getting a ton of +1/+1 counters throughout the course of the game. And if you have enough flyers and enough big creatures, the trample alone is enough that you could probably end a game. The top part here, giving you a bunch of mana dorks, is also really good. We have a lot of tokens that are being created here. So the mana dork ability allows us to play even more stuff, which can be really bad for your opponents. And sorry, that card was water damaged. I actually bought it that way, and they did tell me it was damaged, so I can't get mad, but I just didn't expect it to be that badly water damaged. Next up, we have Sterling Grove for green and white. Other enchantments you control have Shroud, and you can tap one and sacrifice this to search your library for an enchantment card. Put it into, reveal it, shuffle, and put it on top of your library. So this is kind of our has the Enlightened Tutor ability, but also on top of that gives your enchantment Shroud, which is really important because then it forces at that point your opponents to have some sort of board wipe to get rid of your enchantments, and that is not super likely in Commander. Next up, we have Tales of Master Seshiro for 4 and a green. Chapters 1 and 2 say put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control. It gains vigilance until end of turn. And then chapter 3 says exile it and return it. So it returns as Seshiro's Living Legacy, a 5/5 with vigilance and haste. It has haste and it's a 5/5, so being able to attack with this by the time it actually changes is not unlikely. So, you know, I have respect for the body on this one. All right, next up we have Teachings of the Kirin. For 1 and a green, Chapter 1 says mill 3 cards, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. Chapter 2 says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And Chapter 3 says exile the Saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed. Alright, and it returns as Kirin Touched Orochi. Whenever Kirin Touched Orochi attacks, choose 1. Exile target creature card from a graveyard. When you do, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token, or exile target non-creature card from a graveyard. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this one's actually pretty fragile. This is only a 1/1, and the exile target creature from a graveyard can get really annoying for your opponents. So this one's really easy to answer. I don't think this guy stays in play very long, but he is a really good card if you can get him to stick. All right, next up we have the Binding of the Titans. For 1 and a green, Chapter 1 says each player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. Chapter 2 says exile up to 2 target cards from graveyards. For each creature card exiled this way, you gain 1 life. And then Chapter 3 says return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. I don't know, there's not much to say about this one. It's actually really good. Exiling things from graveyards is always great, especially against graveyard decks. Next, we have Birth of Melodus for 1 and a white. Chapter 1 says search your library for a basic Plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Chapter 2 gives you a 0/4 colorless wall artifact creature token with Defender. And Chapter 3 says you gain 2 life. If I was going to take a Saga out of here to replace it for something else, this is probably the top of my list. I do like the 0/4 wall, and the fact that this will probably get to that point by turn 3 is... It could go earlier, but it's usually going to happen on turn 3, is pretty good. But it's not a horrendously impactful card. Next up, we have the Dragon Kami Reborn. For 2 and a green, Chapters 1 and 2 say you gain 2 life, look at the top 3 cards of your library, exile 1 of them face down with a hatching counter on it, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. And then Chapter 3 exiles this and returns it. This one's a pretty cool card. So it returns as a Dragon Kami's Egg, which is 0/1. Whenever Dragon Kami's Egg or a dragon you control dies, you may cast a creature spell from among cards you own and exile with hatching counters on them without paying its mana cost. The more you recur this, the cooler it gets. But even off the first try, you can reoccur. You can put something into play like another Saga or a big creature that you may not have the mana for right off the bat. There's a lot of fun stuff that you can do with this. Okay, next up we have the Fall of Lord Khanda. 2 and a white. Chapter 1 is exile target creature an opponent controls with mana value 4 or greater. Chapter 2 says each player gains control of all permanents they own. And then Chapter 3 exiles this thing, has it come back, transformed. As a 1/3 with Defender, and when Fragment of Conda dies, draw a card. I like this because it's a really good defender, and honestly, trading it to draw a card is never a bad thing, especially in this deck. The more cards we see, the more we can put in play. So, very cool card. All right, next up we have the first Iroan Games. I think this is the first saga that had more than 3 chapters. After that, they've created quite a few, but for 2 and a green, Chapter 1 says create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. Chapter 2 says put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. Chapter 3 says if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw 2 cards. And then Chapter 4 says create a gold token. Gold tokens are the predecessor to treasure tokens. You didn't have to tap them to sacrifice them. You could just sacrifice them, which was obviously pretty powerful. Next up, we have the Mending of Dominaria. For 3 and 2 green, Chapter 1 and 2 say put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. Then you may return a creature card from a... Is it creature only? Yeah, it is creature only. I thought it was land too. Return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. For Chapter 3, you return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, then shuffle your graveyard into your library. This is played often in Windgrace decks, but this is still pretty good in here. Next up, we have Restoration of Eiganjo. It's actually Eiganjo, but yeah. 2 and a white. Chapter 1 says search your library for a basic Plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Chapter 2 says you may discard a card. When you do, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And Chapter 3 says exile and return it. And what we get is Architect of Restoration. This is a 3/4 with Vigilance. Whenever Architect of Restoration attacks or blocks, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. It's really cool for bringing out a bunch of tokens, 1/1 spirits. And it's a 3/4 body, so it's going to stick for a little bit. Right. Next up, we have the Weatherseed Treaty. 2 and a green. For Chapter 1, it says search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. For Chapter 2, you get to create a 1/1 green Saproling creature token. And for Chapter 3, it checks for domain. Target creature you control gets +X/+X and gains trample until end of turn, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. It's only ever going to see +2/+2, but the trample is pretty good, and there's enough creatures in here that get really big that giving it trample can be pretty nasty. All right, next up we have the World Spell, I think. Okay, there's only one after this one. World Spell is 5 and 2 green. Chapter 1 and 2 say look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-saga permanent card from among them and put that into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And then Chapter 3 says put up to 2 non-saga permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. There's enough in here that you won't have to worry about the fact that there's so many sagas in here. And it's just a really good card in general, so very cool. And then last, I believe that's last. Yep, last we have Triumph of Gerard. For 1 and a white, Chapters 1 and 2 say put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control with the greatest power. And then Chapter 3 says target creature you control with the greatest power gains flying, first strike, life, and lifelink until end of turn. Again, the evasion here is really good. The first strike is incredible. The lifelink is great. You're gonna be a problem a lot of the game, so this just makes it even worse. All right. Finally, we're going to look at a Planeswalker here. The only Planeswalker in here is Calyx Destiny's Hand. For 2, a green and a white, enters with 4 loyalty counters. Its +1 is to look at the top 4 cards of your library. You can reveal an enchantment card from among them and put that card into your hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. For -3, you get to exile a creature or enchantment you don't control until target enchantment you control leaves the battlefield. Basically turning one of your enchantments into an O-ring or any numerous of those enchantments that exile things until they leave. And then its -7 is to return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. The -3 is very impactful. There are a lot of enchantments in here. Some of these sagas, maybe you don't want to use that on, but it could be useful for getting rid of something temporarily, or you could do it to yourself if the enchantment is about to die, so you can get a ETB effect again. It's a really versatile ability in this deck. Next up, we are going to take a look at non-basic lands. I didn't go with a high cost land base here because we have a ton of ramp in here, and it just really didn't call for it. I've played this deck a dozen times and I've never really had any issues with the land base. It just works. So we start with an Arctic tree line. It has a forest and plains basic land typing, and it enters the battlefield tapped. Then we go into Canopy Vista, also has a forest and plains basic land typing. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. We got ourselves a command tower, taps for color identity. Got Fortified Village, enters tapped unless you reveal a basic plains or no, it doesn't say basic plains or forest. It just says reveal a forest or plains from your hand, and it taps for green-white. We got Hall of Heliod's Generosity, it taps for generic, and you can pay 1 and a white. And tap it to put target enchantment card from your graveyard on top of your library. Great for reoccurring the sagas, especially the good ones. We got Karn's Bastion. You can tap for generic, or you can tap 4 and it to proliferate. Again, the sagas have counters on them, and the +1/+1 counters are actually pretty important as well. So you're going to get a lot of value out of this. Then we got Nesting Grounds. You can tap it for generic. You can pay 1 and tap it to move a counter from target permanent you control to another target permanent. And activate only as a sorcery. You can shift around the lore counters, but most importantly, well, that is the most important part. You can shift around the lore counters to make it so that certain sagas trigger their chapter again. Next up, we have Overgrown Farmland. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more lands. Taps for green-white. Then we have Radiant Grove, which has both the forest and plains basic land typing. Enters the battlefield tapped. We got Reliquary Tower. You have no maximum hand size. Taps for generic. It's important that you don't have any maximum hand size. Just trust me. We got Selesnya Sanctuary. Bounce land. Taps for green-white. And then we got Temple of Plenty. Enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 1 and taps for green-white. All right, finally, we're going to look at basic lands. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 forests. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 plains. Okay, so that is the Satsuki Living Lore Saga deck. Like I said, when I was building this, I was like, oh, I can't wait to build this. I love Enchantress decks. I'm a huge fan of Enchantress. When I was playing 60-card formats, I played a Legacy Enchantress deck. I think they're very fun to play. And I thought, oh, it's an Enchantress deck. This will be very different. But the thing is, the sagas all basically either give +1/+1 counters or create tokens. And so at the end of the day, this just ends up being a token and +1/+1 counter deck. I know that if I had built a more traditional Enchantress deck, it probably would have segued away from that a little bit, but we still would have been kind of token generating with things like the Sigil of the Empty Throne. So at the end of the day, I think Selesnya is kind of stuck in what it does, and it's kind of unfortunate, but yeah, this is my second attempt at making a Selesnya deck that wouldn't be that way, and it just ended up being that way. Either way, I love it. It was really fun to play. It gets out of hand. The board gets really clogged up because of the amount of things you can do on your turn. There's a lot of recursion in here, a lot of enchantments being played, and it's just a lot of triggers to keep track of. That's something you have to keep in mind, is there's a lot of triggers keeping track of. If you have to do a lot of math with Simic decks, this is probably the one Selesnya deck that you have to do an equal amount of keeping track of triggers and math and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. Keep it positive. I will remove negative comments. And yeah, I think that's it, guys. Until next time. Peace.